going to take an opposite approach with this question. Do you think that there's a risk? Even I'm not saying that talking about PTSD and its link to the military, Lisa Marie, I know you said, separate, it's not just, but there is a theme to this conversation. Do you think that there's a problem with talking about PTSD and soldiers coming back with it too much and sort of glorifying it, where it's like the tortured hero?
Like the way the media is presenting it, and everybody's personal approach is different. I mean, I cannot talk about in the military, but there's like veterans. I've seen some people. You're right. I've seen some people doing it. I've seen some people just going in their basement and just ignoring it. I think how people respond to that, but I mean, there are a lot of civilian that tries to take a voice for the veteran, and that sometimes we disagree with some people deciding what's best for a veteran without really understanding, mental health, or without being a professional. And then whatever, people love their soldiers. Like, we can't deny that. It's part of our history. It's part of our pride. And I think people responding to that, right? Yeah. I think it's balance. I think it's trying to create balance.
I think a lot of times, like mostly from the civilian side, they kind of portray it as like the tortured hero. And I'm sure that like Lisa Marie said, I'm sure there's military people that embrace that themselves. Oh, I'm a tortured hero. I earned my PTSD and all this. You hear that, and it's very seldom, but
it's kind of rare. You see them,
very rare,
but they're not going anywhere with that.
No.
So I think it's go ahead.
Everyone will deal with it differently, and whether you're again soldier or not, but it's like you said before, you don't want the pendulum to sway completely the other way, where you're talking about it so much that it's becoming a badge of honor to be so twisted inside. And woe is me, but I'm not gonna take any action to fix myself.
I'm gonna tell you a story that was funny. At the time, I can't help but being sad and smile at the same time, realizing the impact. General Romeo Dallaire have made a book called Shake Hands with the Devil.
I love that book. I've read it.
Yeah, beautiful book. So, and I was a very, very young medic. We're talking like 1 or 2 years in, and probably maybe a little bit more. But I was a young medic in Montreal, and he had just been found on the bench, drunk, almost dead. But we didn't know who he was at the time. And it was all over the news. So they took us aside, and they decided to talk about, a general that had been found, and you could see people being frustrated. You saw people being like, how is people are going to perceive us now that we, one of our top, somebody that we look up to was in such distress, and everybody had a different perspective on it. And that day kind of went off in my mind till I read the book. And then when I finished the book, and I never realized that was the man. I was reading the book, that it was the man in that day, because I was frustrated. My first response at the time is I was frustrated. I'm like, how can I have a successful career if our top general have a hard time keeping it together? Because that was my understanding. I had absolutely no training and understanding of mental health. And we're talking only 20 years ago. I had, as a medical assistant in the military, I had no training in mental health, or very, very little, that I did not understand how could that happen. And now, so I think this is the pendulum, is we've never talked about it. The first time we actually heard about the concept of post-traumatic stress disorder from combat, because before that it was called shell shock, was with that general. He had that diagnosis, and he started coming in true. And that's why I read the book. And then on the last page, when you said, and on that day when I was found on the bench, I threw the book I threw the book and I got very, very angry and I started crying in anger. And I said, wow, 10 years ago, I have judged that man and now he's my hero. How can I have such a switch in 10 years as an individual about perceiving mental health? And I think that's why people are like, we need to talk about it. We need to talk about it. We need to talk about it. And people are talking over and over and over again, almost to make it acceptable. And I you know, do you know where I'm coming from with that? Like
exactly, it goes back
from coming to looking at him as like almost disgraceful member to my hero, going, he overcome all this and he's talking about it. And then realizing after that, I'm like, wait a second, I actually served with his son. And then making all those connections later. And I'm like, wow, I really, really, really need to take a strong, positive, healthy stand on mental health. Understanding that I was, even as a medical assistant, I was judgmental of that effect.
It goes back to what you were talking about too, with not having anyone speak for you. You know what I mean? A good thing about Dallaire was, if you read that book, that's him. He went through a tortuous process right after coming back home from Rwanda. If you read the preface or the intro, he shelved it and shelved it and shelved it, and a lot of people had to help, pick him up and help motivate him to do it. But at the end of the day, he's speaking for himself with that. And that seems to be the issue as well. You talk about media and mainstream outlets talking for veterans like the two of you, and that's not what you want.
Well, what I feel, that's it. Like you said, it's not bottling it up to a point of explosion, and then it becomes you, because you're only this, because that's been accumulated inside of your body for so long that it consumed you.
Yeah.
So I can see where somebody is like, I am PTSD. This is what has been happening. Maybe sometimes when people have childhood issues or other form of trauma outside the military, that it consumes them to a point of not being able to identify themselves. That's how I feel. That's just a feeling. That's just my idea on how, and that's just one individual. Other people are like, no, I'm doing good with all my traumas. I can self-regulate properly, or I'm emotionless, and to a point of not being healthy at all. Yeah. Right. But everybody, I think it's removing. It's always about removing that stigma.
Yeah.
And I mean, we both got diagnosed with post-traumatic stress with the experience we've come through the military.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I was in Bosnia, and then I went to Afghanistan twice, and my nerve was so thin from being constantly under the dress of fight or flight mode, that I was just completely, my brain was exhausted, just constantly exhausted. And then you're like, okay. And then people have judged me. They're like, you can't wake up in the morning. What's wrong with you? I'm like, I don't know what's wrong with me. I can't comprehend that my body refused just to get up and go get breakfast or go take a shower.
There's no switch there that you can, turn on and off.
No,
you're drained. So there was a time in my life where, when you got diagnosed, it consumes you. Yeah. You're like, I am it. This is it. This is me not being able to brush my teeth, because I'm just looking at the brush. I'm like, this is another chore. Like, everything has become so exhaustive that you just want to sit and almost want to die. That's where I think that the suicide, you just want to give up, because you're like, I'm nothing from being so much active.
Yeah, because you have no quality of life at that point.
Exactly.
It's so interesting to have a little bit of it's actually a huge identity crisis from the way it's been framed. How do you go about what's even the first step from just picking yourself up from that state where you're something as basic as, Lisa Marie, you just said, brushing your teeth seeming like a chore, something that a lot of people take for granted. How do you go about pushing through that? Is it always professional help that's needed?
Well, it definitely helps. You develop strategies. I was saying, through therapy, you develop definite strategies, how to self-care. Well, there's two things that I've learned: self-care and self-nurture. And a lot of people say self-care, oh, take a walk, do this. No, that's not self-care. Self-care is having a shower, brushing your teeth, getting dressed, getting out of bed, actually doing.
Take off your PJ. Yeah.
Self-nurturing is going for a walk, reading a book, doing a hobby. And the one thing we always learned is self-care is what you do to survive, and self-nurture is what you do to thrive.
Craving even more disability content? Links to the full podcast episode and other great clips are only a tap or click away, just waiting for you in the description.